Welcome to Masters with Masters. I'm Ed Hoffman, the director of the NASA Academy for Program Project and Engineering Leadership. This is the first in a series where we pull together two master practitioners to share their lessons, reflections, and thoughts on the practice of engineering and project management. We're very fortunate today to have Chris Scolese and Mike Ryschkewitsch with us. In introducing both of these people that we know very well, Chris Scolese is currently the acting administrator of NASA. Chris began his career in the Navy, where he worked in the nuclear Navy under Admiral Hyman Rickover. In 1987, he joined NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, where he later went on to serve as the program manager of the Earth Observing System. After coming to NASA headquarters as the Deputy Associate Administrator in the Office of Space Science, he returned to Goddard as Deputy Center Director. In 2005, he returned to NASA headquarters once again, this time to serve as the NASA Chief Engineer. Prior to assuming the role of acting administrator in 2009, he was NASA's Associate Administrator. Please welcome Chris Scolese. And Mike Ryschkewitsch is the NASA Chief Engineer. Mike joined NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in 1982 as a cryogenics engineer to work on COBE, the Cosmic Background Explorer, a mission that produced findings about the origins of the universe that resulted in a 2006 Nobel Prize in Physics for the COBE scientists. He then held several management positions at Goddard and supported projects, including the first servicing mission of the Hubble Space Telescope in 1993. He served as director of the Applied Engineering and Technology Directorate at Goddard, during which time he led the 2004 Genesis mishap investigation for NASA, and then became Goddard's Deputy Center Director. In 2007, he was appointed NASA Chief Engineer, and also please welcome Mike Ryschkewitsch. So the first part of what we wanted to talk about is early career and some of the working relationships. And Chris, you worked under Admiral Hyman Rickover. What were some of the reflections and learnings that you had?
Well, my first meeting was fear. Being a young ensign looking to set my career, having to interview him. But working for him, one of the things that I learned that was really important was the importance of being technically competent in whatever your field is that you represent, being clear and being honest. Those three things really set the hallmark, I think, for naval reactors. So you could summarize it all by saying, having integrity and honesty, and you do that, and you'll be successful. That's what I learned from the Admiral.
All right. And Mike, who were some of your early mentors, and what were some of the experiences there?
Well, I was fortunate to have a bunch of them. I came in without a formal engineering background and learned a lot about how you do engineering from people like Al Sherman and Tom Huber. Had the good fortune to join the COBE project, and from people like John Mather, learned about dedication to mission and the needing to just do what needs to get done. And then from people like Dennis McCarthy and Tony Fragamini, they need to keep the big picture all the time of what's important. And frankly, at that point, started to realize just how important the people parts of what we do are. So.
Right. And so what were some of the early experiences that defined your learning as engineers and project people?
Well, probably one of the earliest for me is going to sound kind of weird. Back in the 1960s, when I was in grade school, I found this book by Max Faget, who was ultimately the engineering director at Johnson Space Center. And I still have the book, and I got to know Max later on in his and my life. And he signed it for me, but it covers everything, sort of like what Mike says, that you need to know in order to be an engineer, a project manager. And in the book, it had technical stuff about how to design a rocket, how to design a spacecraft, how to design an environmental control system, guidance, navigation, and control, finance, management of people. So that was one of the early things that I ever had. And then I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of really good people, including Mike. I think we started in, what, 90?
Around 1990, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And some of your early experiences and recollections?
Well, I mean, I think I started off like Chris. I kind of always knew I was going to be a scientist or an engineer. In fact, I flip-flopped back and forth 3 or 4 times about which way I wanted to go. and just kind of evolved. I think for many of us, you end up getting shaped by an early mentor. I ended up actually being signed into all the engineering programs as going to be an engineering major, and then had a undergraduate physics instructor who was just, you know, an inspiring guy, and was the kind of guy you said, boy, this is more interesting than I ever thought, and it kind of led into the laboratory and building things. Didn't realize at the time that when you're an experimental physicist, you're actually doing engineering as much as you're doing physics. So you learn a lot just going through the labs and building things, breaking things, and figuring out how to fix them and go, you know, make them right in the end.
Yeah, the hands-on experiences. And you've obviously followed closely your careers on the engineering and project side and leadership side. How did you start working together, and, you know, why do you follow each other?
It wasn't intentional on my part. It's more of I keep getting calls from Chris or somebody that says, Chris went on to another job, we need you to come here and do that. So I guess we first started getting involved a lot with each other when you were working EOS, and we had an instrument project at one point, and I had a system engineering group where we had a lot of instrument engineers, and those instruments were very complicated, very big, took a lot of effort, and so there were an awful lot of times where just, what's the latest problem du jour? You know, things like on Modus, when fairly late in the game, discovered that the fact that you had clouds in a scene started giving you ghost images and other pixels, and who knows anything about this, and how can we figure out how to sort this out, because we really don't have time to go do that. And it was kind of built on a lot of experiences, but it really cemented a relationship that, you know, you're focused on getting this thing right, and it's not just enough to be within spec all the time. You really need to be able to sit down with a scientist and say, what does it take to really get the observations you need out of this instrument? Whatever the spec says, that's fine, but, you know, is it post-processing? Is it fixing the optics? Is it fixing the detectors? Whatever it is, and just go get the right resources.
Yeah, I mean, that was quite a interesting problem, in fact, the Modus one, because it turned out when we had to work it, that it was something that came about because the instrument was so much better than previous instruments. In the past, having a very bright scene or a very bright pixel next to a dim pixel didn't mean much. Now, with the precision, we were 12 bits, 16 bits of precision, as opposed to what previous ones were, which were 6 or 7 bits, maybe 8 bits if you really were stretching the state of the art. Suddenly you had this huge problem. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, one of the things that you have to do is you have to be honest. You have to, you know, tell people where things really stand and understand what's going on. So we saw the problem. Mike's team, you know, came in and helped us. We never hit it, and went off and worked it. Had a lot of excitement getting to a conclusion. But that started a long-term relationship. Mike and I worked on a number of issues that came up, but that one was probably the most difficult one. Probably the most fun was when we had to restructure EOS. That was most fun. And then as we moved up in management, it got less fun, but equally interesting, as we had to try and solve personnel problems across the center, and then come into the headquarters, where Mike and I worked together to set up the System Engineering Leadership Development Program, which I think is moving along really very well. So we went from really deep down technical things to looking across the whole agency.
You know, people sometimes ask whether we're having fun at what we do, and I think the job description says we're allowed to have rewarding experiences. So, you know, Chris makes a point about Modus. It's got kind of an interesting legacy, because that instrument performed so much better than the minimum that were the specs, and it's now the gold standard. That because it performed so well, it was able to do its job so well. There are a lot of folks in the operational community across the whole government, as well as the scientific community, that look at that as that's become now the floor for what we can expect for future instruments. And if we aren't as good, at least as good as we did on that one. So it's an interesting way the requirements progress. We find out that we can live with no less than what we used to think was going to be darn near impossible. So.
There's a lot of discussions increasingly in literature about how you have to have co-leaders. You have to have people who can work together. And obviously early on you were on joint activities, but did it get to a point where there's an awareness that, hey, there's a good engineering project relationship, and so you keep that going, or is it more, it just happens that way?
I think it just happens that way. I mean, clearly in any large project, you're, particularly at NASA, where most of the people are matrixed to you, and in industry where people are matrixed to you. So they work for a discipline organization, engineering, safety, mission assurance, the science organizations, human resources, finance, you name it. And then there's a project lead that goes off and does something. So there's always a recognition that you have to work together to make things work. And the senior leadership on the organization that's sending you a person, matrixing that person, excuse me, is absolutely critical to the success of your mission. So you have to have a relationship there. The fact that you have a good one just makes it a lot better, but you're going to have a relationship.
Yeah. To me, the key of those kind of relationships is that as long as everybody comes to the table with the idea that the mission is coming first, that whether that's getting today's mission done and launched successfully, or whether it's getting today's mission done in a context that we can also develop the folks for that are going to be doing the next mission, and being able to have that open dialogue and having everybody sensitive to the fact that it's all about the mission. It's not what Mike Ryschkewitsch wants, it's not what Chris Scolese wants, it's what we can do to make that mission successful and make the organization able to do the next job as well.
I also wanted to mention that we have in the auditorium here at headquarters the NASA First Class, current future leaders of the agency. And shortly we're going to start getting interaction in terms of opening up to questions. I wanted to segue into something that both of you have talked about throughout your careers, the importance of learning from success as well as openly learning from failures. And start with Mike. You're involved in the restructuring of COBE. When that was taking place, and how was that a defining experience for you?
Well, COBE kind of was reborn out of what was almost ashes. I mean, I think like many people, I'll never forget the incident I was watching on NASA TV and saw the Challenger accident, and you have that. At first, you don't know what's happening, and then when you realize what's happening, you get that really sick feeling. But COBE was supposed to launch on the shuttle, and at that point we were not, I forgot, 18 months or thereabouts from supposed to launch, and it was configured for the shuttle, and the immediate reaction from everybody was, oh my God, what's this going to mean within the project, what's that going to mean to the project? Of course, that was in the bigger context of a huge family loss. And the learning experience for me was watching Dennis McCarthy and Roger Mattson look at this and say, we may or may not ever launch on the shuttle, but we have to have a plan. Whatever is going to happen, we have to have a plan. And they very quickly brought a bunch of people together, started through the brainstorming, and said, how do we get a 10,000-pound spacecraft and fit it into a 5,000-pound launch capability of a Delta? And they did it. I wasn't a part of the initial team, but for me, the huge learning experience was starting to offer up the ideas of what I could contribute, things that actually would make my job harder, but might offer solutions to other people that would take mass out of the system, allow us to make it more compact so it could fold up instead of being a rigid spacecraft. And it was the kind of thing that could not happen in the traditional, let's write down a set of requirements and flow them down. It had to be an integrated team brainstorming, saying, I could do this if you can do that, and working through that process until you get it close, and then go back and put the structure behind it. And that was a rather enlightening experience, because they went through the whole process of going from nothing to having a configuration that could fit and a plan that could support that in a matter of a few weeks. And it was a rather amazing thing to watch and learn and participate in.
So the challenge of a large redesign, working with a integrated team and pulling that off, and obviously the tremendous success that came from that. Yeah. Chris was involved in the redesign of the Earth observing system in the 1990s, and you've often talked about that. What's your lessons from that experience?
Well, it's a lot like Mike, but I'll go in a slightly different direction. Although it's very similar, it's learning what the real requirements are. The Earth observing system was originally conceived as almost like Kobe, as two very large spacecraft that would carry every instrument that the free world at that time could build, and you'd replicate that many times. So it was either launched with multiple launches on the shuttle, kind of like the space station, but it would be less launches, or it had to be launched on the largest vehicles that the U.S. inventory had at that time, which was the Titan IV. Well, that proved to be difficult to imagine, to make it work. It also proved difficult for the NASA headquarters of that time to convince people that we could do. So when we were asked to go off and look at what we could do, we were given not quite a clean sheet of paper. We were told, you got to do all the same science. We think this old mission was going to cost $32 billion, I think was the number, and you can do it for 11. So it wasn't so much a mass constraint like Mike was talking about, it was a dollar constraint. And we had to go off and understand what the requirements were. What was it that the scientists really wanted? What was it that the operational world really wanted? And how could we mix and match all those instruments together? And ultimately, we did come up with a design. It split it up into several different spacecraft. At that time, a medium-sized vehicle, and several smaller vehicles all the way down to a Pegasus. We launched all of those and more, and I think we did it all for under $8 billion. So we accomplished what people wanted by going off and understanding what the requirements really were, what instruments really needed to fly together, what, as you started to run into difficulties, either with the concept or as you were developing the mission, where could you back off, logically and still accomplish the basic goal of the mission. So it's a lot like what Mike said. It's taking the time to understand what really needs to be done.
Working within that team. Both of you chaired major mishap investigations. How does that shape your thinking in terms of engineering projects and the mission?
Well, it's kind of an interesting context for me because I grew up within Goddard, and one of the things that the folks at Goddard are very, very proud of is to put up their mission success history, and one lost mission in almost 30 years out of I guess it must be about 100. And so what tends to go with that is a little bit of arrogance that you say, we have the people, we have the processes, we have people that know how to do this, and we'll be able to. And at some level in this business, you have to have pride that can often borders on arrogance, because if you don't have that pride and that confidence in what you're doing, you probably aren't going to start on some of these really complicated things. Your first reaction when you see a mishap is, boy, must be some sloppy, incompetent folks that did that. And what you learn in a heartbeat is that there are a lot of very high-quality organizations that at some level either simply made some little mistake or got lulled into some complacence along the way, and it had disastrous complex. But the more important thing you learn is that you're not nearly as good as you think you are. That, working through Genesis, I think every mistake that was made there I had seen someplace in some project that I had worked on. There had been enough other checks and balances and safety nets so that we never had a disaster like that, but I'd seen every attribute in that, and having read a whole bunch of other mishap reports, you see the same kinds of things happening again. And I think one of the things we probably need to do a better job is getting more people onto mishap teams and reading mishap reports and seeing what's out there, because there's such a tiny fine line between success and failure in this business.
Yeah, I started my career, as Ed said, with the nuclear Navy, and Admiral Rickover really believed that we learn more by understanding failures. So when they sent us to school, we studied every failure that ever occurred to understand, why it happened, what did it mean, what were the precursor events, what were the the actual events that resulted in the failure. So we looked at everything back then, and there's a professor, Petrosky, that also does that and writes lots of books on the topic and how you learn from failure. So I'd encourage you to read all of those, because it's like Mike says, it's little things, and sometimes it's little things that just get dropped along the way. They don't appear to be important, but when you add them all up, they have a significant impact. I'd been on mishap boards before, but the one that I chaired was probably the strangest for me, because it seemed absolutely trivial. It was Noah N. Prime. The spacecraft fell over. The spacecraft fell over because the team didn't put any bolts to hold the spacecraft down. So when they started tipping it, it kept on going. You know, that's, I mean, what could be simpler to figure out, right? Well, it turned out it wasn't so simple, because it was a whole bunch of little things, a whole sequence of things that many organizations, that the contractor did, that the government inspectors did, that NASA did, saying, well, this is a good organization. They know what they're doing. They don't have to worry about this. And it all stacked up to the end where it said to the people doing the work, configure the cart appropriately. Okay? And it told the inspectors to make sure that the cart was configured appropriately. Well, okay, now if you put a new team together and a new inspector together, and you put them on a tight time schedule, how do they know what configured appropriately means? So we had to go back a long way. So one of the things I would encourage, is along the lines of what Mike said, is I think people should get on mishap boards. I think it's good for people to do that. But fortunately, we don't have a lot of mishaps. So fortunately or unfortunately, you won't get on a lot of mishap boards. You won't have many opportunities. But there's a lot of really good books about that. Petrosky is an author you can go to and Google that, and you can see all of his texts, and you can pick them up in many places so you can learn about it. And there's new books coming out as well that talk about it. There's a new book about one that I'm actually going to have to pick up about the SL-1 incident, which was a reactor that was built in the 1950s and operated in the 1960s by the Army. And it had a failure, and there's new information. So it's one of the ones I had to learn when I was a young ensign. So it'll be kind of fun to see what they learn. But I would encourage you, if you can't get on a mishap board, to take the time and read some of those books.
Before we go further, I mentioned we have NASA First here, so we're going to start getting you to do some work by having a chance to ask some questions. So before we go into project management and systems engineering, any questions at this time?
I was wondering, you had mentioned some of the lessons that you had learned from the projects you've worked on and the mishap boards, but you also mentioned that mentors were very important in your careers, and I was wondering if you could tell us about some of the things that you learned from the mentors that you had.
Well, that's easy. I mean, I've had mentors throughout my career. I still have mentors. I still people that I talk to on a regular basis. And you learn lots of different things. I think almost all of them would tell you got to be honest, you got to understand your field, you got to be open. Now, of course, when I talk to people, I say, how do I talk to Congress? You know, how do I do these other things? You know, how do you make a public speech? But mostly, I think it's those things plus the other, which was encouraged. I mean, mentors play a lot of different roles in your career. And I know when I was first asked to be a project manager, and I told some of you this yesterday, that was a real change for me, because I had been an engineer my entire career. I'd done engineering. I had a little bit of a different relationship when I was in the Navy, because when you're in the military, as a military officer, you take on different roles. But still, that was a big step, and people said, you have to take the chance now to do it. There'll be a reward either way, whether you succeed or you fail. And I did it, and it was a big change. But I think without having a mentor there, somebody to talk to and understand the risks, it would have been a much harder decision. I don't know, Mike.
Mine's similar. I've had a lot of mentors. I don't think I've ever had somebody that I went to and said, "Will you be my mentor?"
Yeah.
But I've had a lot of folks that either I sought out because I saw that they were behaving in a way that seemed to be doing the right thing for the organization, was successful, or I wanted to use them as a sounding board. And I've probably always had 3 or 4 people that I used in those kinds of roles, including Chris is one of them. Interesting that I think you learn something different from every mentor, which is probably why it's really important to not just have one mentor. From some of them, I learned how you really did engineering within NASA. From others, it may have been even the more important. In fact, one of the more crusty project manager types that I've worked with was Tony Fragamini, and he about half the time I'd come down the hall by his office, he'd stick his finger out and said, "Come here." And when he did that, I knew that he was going to take me in his office, close the door, and advise me on how I needed to work better with other people and how I had just said something the wrong way in a meeting and I could have done something better. And it was rather amazing when I started seeing those insights and started thinking about them. But there are a lot of different things like that. If you look around and see who are the people that are always able to find a constructive way out of a problem, be able to get people to work together and go pick their brains, because one of the nice things about people at NASA is that they're almost universally, they want to share with you. They're proud of what they do. They're proud of what we are all trying to do together, and they would like to share with you what they know and help you be successful.
Another question?
I'm Valerie Line-Miller from Johnson Space Center, and I have a question for you that kind of goes along with the mishap. How would you advise us on how to lead a team after a mishap or a tragedy has happened?
Well, it's never easy because people are naturally defensive about what happened. So leading a team, the first thing is you're not looking for blame. You're looking for understanding. And making people recognize that and understand that is important. And why are you looking for understanding? You're looking to clearly to prevent a similar type of mishap in the future, but you're also looking for the root causes, the deep down causes, so that you can provide a better answer, a broader experience base for all the other people that follow. So that's the message that you have to get out. You have to tell your team that's their job. Their job isn't to go off and find somebody and say, "You're the blame." That's not what we do. That's not the purpose of the mishap board. There's other people that do that. Our job is to understand why things didn't go right so that they don't happen in the future. And that's about the only message you can do, because people, it's always funny. You read the press and they all act like, people went into this and they were just careless, and you read these postscripts that look at it. And that's never the case. People don't work hard to cause a failure. I mean, that's not what you're doing. So you need to, people are going to feel bad, and you have to go off and point out to them that your job isn't to make them feel bad, your job is to make them successful in the future.
Yeah, for me on Genesis, I mean, when I came on board with a mishap board, it was exactly what Chris said, making sure that everybody knew that the intention here was to figure out what had happened so that we can make ourselves better. But I'll have to give kudos to both the JPL and the Lockheed Martin management, because as soon as the mishap occurred, they called their teams together, and for the folks that were out in Utah, they made it real clear that their first priority was to make sure that they could recover the science, because it turned out that in the long run we were able to recover the science. The mission has been declared a success. As hard as mind-boggling as that is, when you see the pictures of a crashed spacecraft, they were able to recover the samples and analyze them. But the other message that they gave their teams, both then and in the ensuing days, was that it was really important to be as open and honest as you possibly could, because you never knew what little piece of information was going to be important in figuring out what had happened. And they sent the message to their teams that they wanted the mishap, the investigation to proceed properly, so that they could learn and they could get better too. So, two different things. If you're part of a board, is making sure that people understand that's your goal. If you happen to be a leader in an organization that had a mishap, is looking out for the immediate things to get everything safe and secure, but making sure your people understand that for you it's important to learn from this experience too.
I think before maybe we go to the next segment, one more question, and we'll.
Thank you. Nalan Rathnayaka from Dryden Flight Research Center. We're an agency that obviously faces a lot of technical challenges, but what about the softer stuff? What are some of the biggest soft challenges we face, be it intergovernmental or public perception or workforce or something along those lines? And what are the leadership skills that are going to be necessary now and in the future to address those?
Well, you guys are part of the answer to one of the soft challenges that we have as an agency, because for better or for worse, we're an agency that was formed out of a lot of different cultures and has grown. Those cultures have persisted over the years, and we've not ever had to operate in as cohesive a manner as we're going to have to operate in order to be successful at Constellation. So a very important challenge for us is to be able to learn to talk to each other, to be able to learn to trust each other across the agency, to be able to learn that as good as we are at our center, that there are folks at other centers that are as good or better at some things, and we need to pull on all of them. And so frankly, one of the powers of a group like this is that you guys are going to have to be bridges in the future, that you're going to have to make sure that your colleagues, when you go back to your home centers, know that you've learned a lot from your colleagues across the agency, and that you can help interpret why are these guys, when I call the phone and ask them something, why do they answer that way? That doesn't make sense to me. You can be the interpreters, and you can be the bridge, and you can help them make a connection. And so trying to build that across the agency is going to be really essential for us, because we're not going to be able to do this as one or two or three centers to be able to carry us beyond low Earth orbit permanently.
I'm not going to add anything much more to that. I would say that, you often hear some people say, the most important thing is communication, the next most important thing is communication, and the next most important thing after that is communication. That's something that engineers, aren't terribly good at. I mean, that's why we're engineers, probably. And so what Mike says is really important, and your role in that is going to be really important for the future. So I really don't want to add anything more than that one. I think Mike hit it right on the head.
Why don't we talk a little bit about project management and systems engineering, and then we'll go back to some more questions. Start with Mike. What do you see as the relationship between the systems engineer and the project manager, and the importance of that?
Well, frankly, they need to be like Siamese twins. Because it's interesting, we've done some recent studies to try to figure out what are the essential attributes of people that are successful at system engineering of complex systems, and people that are successful at managing the projects, and you see a huge amount of overlap. And so, there are folks that tend to have the same kind of skills, but focused on different things. I mean, clearly a project manager, in the environment he lives, the people outside of him tend to focus on cost and schedule. And at the same time, the successful project managers know how to do all of that and make it go forward, but they also know how to focus on the essential of technical success. System engineers have to do the same kinds of things. Cost and schedule are their trade parameters. They're focused on technical success, but they also know that they can't be successful in ensuring the technical success unless they're also successful in helping the project manager to deal with cost and schedule. And so they both need to be keeping the big picture. They both need to know that all of those parameters are essential, but they also need to know that they have a role in a bigger piece, and be able to build the trust relationship so they can all do what they do best.
It's hard to add to that, but a couple of things. I do think that there's an incredible overlap between the lead system engineer or the chief engineer, depending on how you want to define it, and the project manager. Probably the best system engineer should be the project manager, but the project manager doesn't have the time to be able to do all of those things. So while the project manager and the chief engineer have to work together, as Mike said. I can't really add much more to it. The chief engineer has an additional role. The project manager has to make sure that the project is doing what it's supposed to do. And that includes meeting the technical requirements, meeting the cost requirements, meeting the schedule requirements. Has to convince the outside world, including upper management, that they're on the right path, they're dealing with problems effectively, be able to go off and get adjustments to resources if that needs to be done in a constructive way, and needs to convince the team that they're heading in the right direction and keep them focused on what they're doing. That takes a lot of energy. So the chief engineer or the system engineer has an additional thing. They have to be a little voice in the back of your head. They have to be the conscience of the project, because they have the time to go off and look at it and make sure that it really is going to meet the goals that's there. And while a project manager may, every once in a while, and I've been in both roles, think that cost is the most important thing they have to do, it is only if in the end it's going to be successful. And the chief engineer has to be able to be cognizant of those issues, as Mike said, but also willing to speak up and say, if you don't do this, you don't expend this additional dollars, or you don't take additional time, you aren't going to get there. And it has to be forceful about that. The other thing I want to add is, we always talk about the system engineer and the system manager, but for us, in the roles that we typically play now, all of us have to be the system engineer. Now, I don't even care, what your profession is. You have to be able to look at the whole mission, or at least the elements that interface with your element. And I'm really talking the whole thing, whether it's HR, whether it's resources, and obviously, if you're an electrical engineer or a mechanical engineer, you have to understand how your pieces fit together, or else the whole thing isn't gonna work well. We very seldom in NASA actually have people that are just designing a circuit board or just designing a valve. As a minimum, that valve is going to have an interaction with a fluid system or a pressure system of some sort, and you need to understand how they're going to relate. And of course, every valve nowadays is monitored, right? So you have to know how it works with the sensor and the software, and pass that information on. So to an extent, all of us have to be system engineers, or at least be cognizant of it.
Yeah, I think there's a point we tend to miss sometimes in the formalization of our projects. I mean, we have these very highly structured processes for establishing requirements, for doing trade studies, for really good reasons. I mean, we learned hard lessons in the 50s and 60s about what happens if you don't have those in these very complex projects. That said, I think that at times we forget that those processes are run by human beings, and they're not perfect. And so it's incumbent on every one of us, from the knowledge that we have, to make sure to live up to our responsibility as a stakeholder in NASA and our success, to be able to raise our hand and say, okay, I know what the requirement says, but something doesn't make sense to me. And you may be just clarifying a communication of how that's written and get a better understanding of what you need to do, or you may be pointing out an issue that's going to buy us out of a problem downstream. And that happens a lot on the technical side, but it happens just as much on the human capital or the procurement side. Somebody on the procurement side that raises their hand at the right point and says, the SEB really needs to go back and go do this issue, may buy us out of a protest that could save us 6 months downstream. And that 6 months that you lost in that protest may be the one that ends up pushing you into a test program that is less than you wanted. So these things all tie together, and it really doesn't matter whether you're working on the technical side of the house or the business or the procurement side of the house. We all own a stake in we all own a piece of the success of the future, both of our projects and of our agency.
Kind of leads to the emphasis on healthy tension that, Chris, you talk a lot about. Can you describe that healthy tension between engineering and program?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier. It's the tension between the programmatic, because every project is measured by, in the end, by how well it succeeds technically. No one cares how much Hubble overran. No one cares how much the Mars rovers overran. But they do all the while you're developing it. So the pressures on the project are always on cost and schedule, because there's an assumption that you're going to meet the technical requirements. You're going to do that. At least that's my belief, that people assume you're going to meet the technical requirements. And I think people assume that we can, schedule and predict with fine accuracy inventions. Because almost all of our missions require inventions. We seldom do the same thing twice. In fact, I like to say no two identical spacecraft are the same. And in NASA, that's really true, because we don't ever do anything the same. So the tension then is between the pressures that are on the project team, the project leadership in particular, to go off and justify every dollar that's spent, every hour that's spent, every person that's on the project, why you're not coming down the ramp like you're supposed to be coming down the ramp, why you're deviating from the plan. The technical side is, and appropriately is, looking to make sure that the mission can succeed. So they're looking for better ways of doing things. And not just because they want to do better ways. I mean, sometimes that's the case, but oftentimes it's to go off and try and find the best solution to solve the problem. Well, that best solution may require an additional test. It may require additional analysis. It may require additional people. It may require you to buy a more complex component. It may require you to change what you're doing. So there's the tension when you have that. And it's the dialogue between the project manager and the chief engineer that reduces that tension. As long as they're working together and they're working with the engineering team or the science team, they'll come to a reasonable answer. But they need to communicate an awful lot. And that communication is usually between those two parties, almost exclusively between those two parties.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing in an engineering enterprise, particularly when you're doing complex things that haven't been done before, that it's extremely difficult to know what's good enough. And in fact, I mean, it's inherent in the kind of things that you do, that you only know where the boundary is when you failed. Because if you succeeded, you didn't push hard enough, right? So my uncle used to tell me that you're not learning about skiing unless you're falling. I think that was supposed to make me feel better when I got up the first day and could hardly stand up at the end of the day. But it's that tension of trying to figure out what's good enough and trying to argue through the attributes of a system. What risk are we really taking if we can't do this test? Sometimes the pressures are really clear. If you've got a planetary launch window, and if you put on a very long test program that you just won't get there, it doesn't do any good to have a perfect Mars rover if it's sitting on the surface of the Earth. So it's having that dialogue of how good is good enough, where the risks lie, and ultimately, we've never launched a perfect system. We've always had to take risks, sometimes very significant ones, in things that we launch, and it's making sure that everybody understands clearly where those are, how we could do better, what we buy if we try to do something different, and having that dialogue, sometimes impassioned, and being willing to carry it as far as you need to carry until you're satisfied that people really understand what they're doing. So.
Mike, what do you look for that determines whether a project is successful or unsuccessful, besides the obvious other things that you see when you're reviewing or looking at a project?
Well, we have all the standard things that show up in our NPRs and our guidelines for reviews. Frankly, if I want to know whether a team is actually going to be able to do what they do, I'm looking for what's happening in a meeting. So if you're seeing a meeting where people are having some kind of an issue, and if they're having a passionate discussion about what's the right thing to do, but people are doing it in the context of trying to be constructive, then I think that they're on the right track. If you've got a bunch of people in the room and everybody's simply shouting about their point of view and not trying to figure out what's essential to the mission, then you've got a problem. Somebody asked me once, what do you worry about when you go into a shuttle FRR? I worry a lot when things are too quiet, that there's something that we should be talking about or not. And I worry a lot when we have a problem like the flow control valves on the most recent mission, where everybody is talking about that one, that there's something else out there that, that we're not focused on that's going to come back and get us. I guess the bottom line is I tend to worry a lot, but oh well, that's part of the business.
Right.
So.
Yeah, worrying is part of the business. That's what you always do, because we are doing things for the first time, and you don't always know what, you don't know what's right. You know what you think is right, but you don't know what is right. So you have to look at all of the factors that go into it. Was it designed correctly? Was it understood? And that requires looking at the people, looking at the team, just as Mike said. So you do look exactly like Mike said, at team dynamics. The other thing, just to add to it, is talk to the leadership of the team, is what I do. You know, if the project manager or the chief engineer or the head financial person or the head safety and mission assurance person can't tell you pretty clearly what it is that they're doing, then probably the project doesn't know what it's supposed to do either. So in addition to looking at what the team is doing and what the dialogue is and what the product is that's being developed, it's to also go off and look at what the leadership knows and how they can express themselves.
Yeah, that's, to me, that's one of the discriminators between the good project managers and the great project managers. The great project managers know exactly how to get a team into having the discussions early, not shutting them off too soon, but then getting them to the point where, yeah, it's time to make a decision, even if you don't have perfect information. And perhaps as importantly is making sure that everybody understands why they're making the decision that they are, because it's not very satisfying to anybody for people to be part of a passionate discussion and somebody to come in and say, we're doing A, and they thought C was the right answer. It's a big difference if somebody comes in and says, we're doing A, I heard what you said about B and C, but A is the right thing for us to do now because, and give all of that rationale, and especially if they're acknowledging that there may be events downstream that cause us to change course, but this is the direction we need to go today, and that makes for a powerful leader of a project team.
Why don't we open it up for a couple of questions?
Hi, I'm Mark Poppy from JSC. When people are shouting like you're mentioning in a meeting, and you're the leader, what are some tools that you can use to bring the group back to a productive state?
Well, I don't think Mike really meant shouting in that particular case.
Occasionally.
But when it does get out of hand, you just got to take a step back, remind people where they're at and what they're doing, and recall one of the things I said before. If the leader, it doesn't have to be the project manager, the leader of that particular meeting doesn't know enough about the subject to be able to bring people back, then you've got a real problem. But that's what you got to do. I mean, when it starts getting out of hand, you got to take a step back, remind people why they're there, tell people that you're looking for a solution, and this is where you want to go, and these are the constraints that we have to work within. That's how you get them back. Most of the time, though, that's not the issue. It's mostly keeping the discussion focused and productive towards a solution, and that that's generally pretty easy. People around here are really smart. They understand what needs to be done.
It's usually a matter of just keeping people focused on the problem. And occasionally you'll see something that people are starting to focus on each other rather than on the problem. And engineers like to attack things. And if you make them sure that they're attacking the problem, you can stay in good shape. And perhaps a little free with words. I mean, passionate discussions are really important, and sometimes they can get on the loud side. But as long as it's always attacking the problem, that's perfectly fine. Although the culture is different in different places. So, you got to know a little bit about what the local culture is before you step into the middle of something. I've worked with groups that when you were in the room, if you didn't know what was going on, you'd swear that these people were going to break into fisticuffs. And yet they'll they'll come to a conclusion, they'll walk out of the meeting, and they'll all go have lunch. And they're best friends. And there are other groups that are extremely polite and formal about the discussions, and it's kind of like the discussions in the Senate. The more formal they get, the angrier they are with each other. So you do need to know what the local culture is and learn about it before you step in the middle and figure out how to try to guide it.
What advice would you give to folks in terms of their learning and development? And maybe start with Chris.
Keep on doing it. There's never a reason to stop. Read books, take courses, seek out people that you go off and learn from. Seek out mentors. You just got to keep on doing it. And ultimately, you know, when an opportunity comes, take the chance. You'll be surprised at what you can do. You can do great things, but you got to take the opportunity when it comes to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's good advice. The thing I might add to that is make sure you're having fun, make sure you're having doing things that you find rewarding. This business is way too hard. It takes way too many hours to be doing something that you're not enjoying. And if you're not, then you probably need to go find something else that you will enjoy, because you know it tends to be consuming. It's the kind of business where your best insights are going to happen when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and realize what it was that's been bugging you all week. And that's the kind of thing that you can only make a career at that if it's something that you really are enjoying and find rewarding.
All right. Well, let's thank Chris and Mike for taking the time and sharing with us. Really appreciate that. And also want to thank the NASA First Class for your commitment to learning and taking your time to be with us today, and NASA TV for helping us go through this. So thank you for your time, and stay in touch with us through different offerings in terms of knowledge sharing and Ask Magazine, Ask the Academy, and those activities. So thank you.
Thank you.